It's his second day on the job, and there will be no comparisons to Conan O'Brien. Give you Assembly Republican Leader Sam Blakeslee.
Well, greetings, and thank you all for coming by to chat about what the governor just spoke about. My background is as a strategic planner for Exxon, where I've faced some of these difficult crises in a business setting. And as we saw this week with General Motors, California is not alone in facing some of the restructuring challenges that we're grappling with today. GM is laying off 22% of their employees, closing 14 factories, and letting go 42% of their dealers in an effort to ensure they can protect their core business and stay alive so they can thrive another day. As a former strategic planner, I understand that those are the circumstances that the state of California faces, that we too are going to need to make the types of reforms that will allow us to survive and thrive another day. And what we heard from the governor is a broad outline of a proposal that I think deserves serious merit. It's a framework which I think demonstrates the governor heard the voters and heard the voters loud and clear. It's a basic framework which says, first, we cannot solve this problem by adding burdens to the economy through raising taxes. That's a prescription for failure, and it's not an approach which will allow us to work our way out of this problem. Second, we as a state must live within our means. We cannot print money, and we cannot hope for a better economy in the short term, which means that we must live within our means by taking direct action in the near term. And third, to ensure the maximum delivery of services to the most vulnerable populations, and that the dollars we do spend end up with the greatest benefit to those in need, we need to streamline government, we need to cut overhead, and we need to essentially overhaul how we do what we've done for over a generation. The governor is right in saying we need to move with alacrity. Delay it is not going to benefit the state of California. As the longer this goes on, the greater the cash flow crisis we will face. But I will also say that we must be sure that we achieve the reforms that are necessary to ensure a successful California. We found ourselves in this position in large part because of ruinous, though sometimes well-meaning policies which have devastated the state's economy. If we are ever to have the revenues that we want to see going into our classrooms and protecting those in the greatest need, we must become a state which is open for business, which has head of household jobs for those who have hope and aspiration for a better life and for their families, and must understand that jobs are essential for prosperity. Those are the sorts of reforms which will allow us not only to solve the problem we face today, but to return this golden state to prosperity so that we never face these dark days again.
Thanks, Sam. How's the mic picking up? Is that working good for you? Okay. Talk into the mic. Talk into the microphone. Well, good morning, and I too, with Assemblyman Blakeslee, share a lot of, I think, common themes this morning. We are responding to the governor's message to the joint legislative body a few moments ago, and we have to say that there are a lot of things that we think we have to do in common. The way we took the governor's message was that a lot of the choices have been taken off the table, and unfortunately there are very few choices left to righting the ship of California's government, and that is that we have to make some very painful cuts. But the second part of his message, and just as important, is that we have to reform California and we have to change the way Sacramento does business. Sacramento has operated for too long as though what we do here doesn't matter in terms of the people and their jobs outlook, the people and what they do with their own checkbooks and their own families, and we have to change that. So I think Assemblyman Blakeslee and I would agree that we have to look at these reforms in conjunction with the types of cuts that are now unavoidable. Reforms will make sure that every dollar, every precious taxpayer's dollar is spent efficiently. Number one, we have to make sure that we accomplish the types of performance-based budgeting that we have proposed very quickly. We have talked about it. We have pushed it through both of our caucuses for a number of years, as well as many of the other reforms that were mentioned this morning. But now's the time we actually have to do it. And if we don't, we will continue to be spiraling from crisis to crisis to crisis. We want to end the budget crisis cycles. We want to make sure that California gets out of this budget downturn through a number of ways. First is, of course, budget accountability and performance. Change the way that we do budgeting, make it more transparent, make it more open to the public. Doing that through the conference committee is the way that we prefer, and doing that in the open with public votes on all of those proposals. We think that budget performance accountability as well means that if you've got programs and you've got agencies that are not producing something for the people of California, or if they are being wasteful, that they should be scaled back or they should be ended. And every few years, we ought to look at every bureaucracy, and they should be able to justify their continued existence for the people. Otherwise, they should have a term limit imposed on that bureaucracy. Legislative sunshine and accountability. We think we need to stop the type of actions where we end up having bills voted on that nobody's read. We need to make sure we're doing these things with lots of public access to them, and make sure that we're not doing these things in the dark of night again. The bureaucracy reduction and accountability fits right in with what the governor was saying as well, that consolidating these boards and commissions, consolidating different functions of government, there's no reason to have duplicative agencies and bureaucracies when we are fighting for every tax dollar to be spent as efficiently as possible. We've got to have job creation and retention. The key here is that we're not going to get out of these downturn cycles and have California be the golden state again, where we're the most resilient state to economic recessions until we start creating jobs. That includes making sure that our tax rates are competitive with other states, that we get rid of overburdensome regulations, and we make sure that in the long-term picture we do both of those things, and we have a trained workforce coming out who can be successful in any career they choose. The key also is that we've got to make these decisions quickly. We've got to make the tough decisions now. We know it's going to be difficult, but we think with these reforms in conjunction with the tough decisions that are also facing us, we can make it a better future for all California. Thank you. Can we answer any questions?
How do you lower tax
Why
rates?
aren't revenues on the table? Adding revenues on the table?
Sam, you want to go?
Sure. You know, we have an economy which is in intensive care. Another round of tax increases above what just occurred 12 weeks ago would put that patient in a cardiac arrest. Nothing would be more injurious to jobs and prosperity in California than another round of brutal tax increases. Our economy is teetering on the edge. It would be a penny-wise and pound foolish choice.
How do you get from now, if you lower taxes or make them more competitive, as you say, and then still have money that you need to come in until you see the benefits of this tax?
Well, the key is that lowering certain tax rates actually produces more revenue. We've seen this time and time again, that if you lower certain tax rates, you create jobs, that produces more revenue. The governor also mentioned in his talk this morning that we need to be looking at a more stable tax system. We think it needs to be fairer. We think it needs to be more simple, simpler and fairer. Would mean that you would have these peaks and valleys erased, and you would have a more stable revenue system. So the key is you got to create more jobs to get more revenues, and a good tax policy will reflect that.
Dennis, would either of you vote, and Sam too, would either of you vote for the governor's budget as it stands today?
We would, well, I'm not going to speak for Sam, but I'll tell you that we think all those cuts that we're looking at have to be clearly examined. They're going through them right now in that conference process, And we've got to do exactly what he said. We've got to adjust the spending to the revenue that we have.
So you're not prepared to say, I mean, you haven't read it enough, is that what you're saying? Or?
Well, there are some things in there that are not necessarily the reductions that bring things into balance with the revenue that we have. You know, there's some, well, there's some borrowing in there. Now you have some of it replaced. That's moving in the right direction. So I can't say that, you know, we're going to put that exact budget up on the floor, because the Democrats aren't going to put that exact budget up on the floor today.
And I guess I would respond, say that I believe our caucus probably would be supportive of the magnitude of the cuts, as difficult as that would be. We would seek to move those cuts further away from the classroom, higher up into the chain of bureaucracies and administrations. We'd seek to ensure that, to the degree possible, the recipients of critical state dollars we'd ensure that the support systems that oversee those that deliver services would take a disproportionately heavy cut, because we believe that bureaucracy needs trimming back. So until that next step in refining the governor's proposals, I think, have been taken, we wouldn't be prepared to put up the vote. But the magnitude of the cuts, I think, is very close to what we ultimately are probably going to need to see.
Are these wholesale elimination of programs inevitable? The Democrats are suggesting more of a surgical approach, but do you believe that it's possible you can get to the number you need to get to with a quote-unquote surgical approach, or are you going to have to eliminate programs like Health Campus?
It was a 27% decline in revenue. It's not clear that a surgical approach is realistic. There are those who, like to say these changes can be achieved without pain and difficult consequences. I don't share that view. I think this is a place where none of us wants to be. Gives none of us any joy. We've shed tears in our office and meeting with constituents and talking about how this is going to affect their lives. But we need to be honest, this is going to be a very, very tough budget.
And this is something that could have been avoided. I mean, not to go back over old history, but I think Sam and I would both tell you that both of our caucuses have warned for years that the type of runaway spending couldn't be sustained. That if we'd have simply had more tempered growth in spending, even over just the last few years, that this budget crisis would not be looking at the type of wholesale slaughter of programs and functions of government that we're now looking at.
You talked generally about trading off some bureaucracy cuts for education cuts. They're looking at $8 billion plus in education cuts. Can you be a little more specific about where you find that kind of money in the bureaucracy proposals?
Sure. For example, when it comes to how we essentially determine eligibility for a number of health and welfare services to move into that arena as opposed to education right now, we could essentially collapse much of that eligibility review into a single function so that you don't have 57 different counties essentially having their own separate overheads. There are huge savings in terms of centralizing what are redundant functions and moving to the next generation of technologies so that it becomes more of a seamless process. That would eliminate tremendous numbers of people who are involved in essentially the bureaucratic ways and means of pushing paper.
Aren't all those programs already targeted for cuts with health and welfare and those other big, presumably some of the stuff?
We want to be sure that the actual reforms are implemented. The cuts are scored, but are the reforms embedded in how those cuts will be implemented? If the reforms are not implemented, you will have the cuts hurting the most vulnerable instead of creating the kind of efficiencies that we see in the private sector and that we're now demanding out of government.
Some of the newer things that came out of the governor's speech, he talked about privatizing prisons. Is that something that in your view would think is a good idea, or the state should explore?
Go ahead.
Sure. My sense is privatizing prisons is more of a longer range discussion, because obviously the time frame involved is not commensurate with or is not well aligned with the urgency of the problem we're facing. We have right now runaway healthcare costs, which are not supportable, and frankly, felons in our state penal system are receiving a Cadillac healthcare, or at least we're paying for Cadillac healthcare, when many in our society are receiving virtually no healthcare. So I think number one, we need to go right after the issue of healthcare. Second, many of the reform efforts that are being undertaken seem to be largely ineffective and not particularly well thought out. Some of those are going to need to probably be pulled back to the tune of several $100 million. There are also a number of unfilled positions, again, probably at the supervisorial and administrative level. Similarly, we probably need to fill some levels more at the operational level to reduce overhead. Clearly, it's going to take an approach toward corrections which achieves those savings, but doesn't do it in a way which endangers the public, or because you do it in an ineffective way, you raise costs through overhead because you don't have enough guards to make sure that the prisoners are adequately supervised. And again, with the runaway health care costs largely, I think, produced by the actions of a federal receiver, we can and will push back on that front.
Well, the key thing...
recently announced that they're close to a deal that was far scaled back from that and could end the receivership possibly within 18 months. Would you support that as a way to scale back?
Well, we would argue that it's because we've not rolled over for this receiver and played what we believe is the role we need to play in representing the people of California, that the overreach of the receiver is being beaten back. Obviously, given the subject of very delicate negotiations, probably not going to conduct them in public right now.
Well, let me...
prisons that would lead to cost reductions.
Sure. On behalf of my caucus, on your issue, we need to see where the money's coming from. We don't think the state can afford $8 billion that was originally intended for the receiver to grab out of the state's coffers. We also, at this point in time, want to know where the $2 billion is going to come from. Jim, to your point, my caucus is on both sides of that issue, so I think where we need to be looking, though most immediately, and as I agree with Sam, as he said, that's a longer-term issue, but more immediately, we need to be looking at why is it that we're paying $14,500 a year in health care costs for every prisoner. That's just outrageous. And you look at what the receiver's been paying, we've got psychiatrists and dentists and doctors making $450,000 and $500,000 a year. That's insane. We ought to be looking at containing those costs first. Sure, we should be looking at private reentry facilities, private construction of some of these facilities, but we sure shouldn't be looking at building Taj Mahal hospitals for our state prison system.
Guys, you may have been asked this. In terms of revenues to minimize the cuts that we're talking about, Democrats were talking about shifting of funds, accelerating the collection of PIT. Do you think you can collect or raise revenues to the extent that you can significantly minimize the kind of cuts we're talking about? What's your sense of that?
My sense would be no. That we're not interested in raising taxes again on the people of California, as my colleague Sam here has said. That would be a fatal blow to the economy and probably be a very devastating blow to millions of California families. The type of revenue anticipation things, revenue acceleration things, excuse me, that have been proposed, I think are very small fixes that we really need to be careful about.
Well, and the other downside, of course, of actions which simply accelerate revenues is it then potentially leaves a hole next year when we're most likely going to, again, face a very difficult and challenging budgetary circumstance. We also, as you know, have a window where we, for a temporary period of time, are going to have taxes elevated to the tune of about $12 billion. We're going to go off, that revenue cliff as well. So the degree that we're continually pulling in revenue from the future to try and sustain spending at a level that's ultimately unsupportable, we're only creating a greater problem in the actually not very distant future. So we need to look at all such proposals very carefully to be sure we don't essentially create a bigger problem for either this legislature or the next.
What tax cuts can be made now that would actually generate revenues?
Well, you know, if you took a look at some of the things that we've had in the past, like R&D credits, manufacturers' investment credits, lowering the corporate tax rate to the national average, those are the types of things we should be looking at that would be revenue producers that would not actually cost the state treasury money, but would create jobs that would bring more money in.
The Democrats,
right now.
I think it should be on the table.
the Democrats suggested a phased approach in solving the deficit, doing, sounded like something before June 15th and maybe doing some more later. What's your opinion on that?
Well, I think we definitely have to act very quickly on these spending reductions. We've got to bring the spending in line before June 30th on a number of issues. And we've got to make sure that we are making our books balanced so that we're dealing with our cash situation before we start moving into July, before we start moving into July and August. The reforms need to go right along with that. I think the message that Sam and I are saying is that you can soften the blow of these devastating cuts if you have reforms that go along with it. If you were to make sure that we sent every 70% of every dollar that we spend on education to the classroom, those education cuts would be severely softened. It's things like that that we need to do in conjunction and at the same time as the spending reductions.
Do you support two of their particular cuts, the cutting of the Cal Grants program?
Can I respond to that first question just before we move on to the next one? That's okay. Not only did the people vote on May 19th, but very shortly the markets will vote. And if we do not solve the majority of the shortfall in the very near future, the markets will vote by not allowing us to obtain the short-term monies to deal with the cash crisis that we anticipate will occur this summer. So any scheme to essentially make some easy cuts now and worry about and delay more significant cuts until September, I think ultimately we'll find the markets voting with their feet, and we won't be in a position where there'll be anybody present in the room when we try and sell the rands that are necessary to keep the state afloat. So at least from my perspective, I think there's great risk at trying to take this in a piecemeal approach.
Are you getting the sense from your negotiations where is that where?
I don't think that's been determined. I think all these discussions are in play right now.
Can you talk about those two specific programs that are proposed for cuts, limiting some of the Cal Grants over time, as well as rolling back healthy families? So those things you guys are supportive of?
No, we're not supportive of that, but unfortunately, as the governor said, we don't have any other choice. We have to cut spending to bring it in line with revenues. You know, the key thing here is that this type of spending growth couldn't be sustained. And so now we've got the kind of devastating cuts we're looking at ahead of us. Unfortunately, that's the situation we're in. But you go along with that is that we can't justifiably go out to the people of California and say, we've got 2 agencies dealing with boating and waterways. We've got 3 tax collection agencies, and you go on down the governor's list. We can't say we're spending 1 dime on those things, whether it's general fund or special fund, when we're having these types of discussions about those types of cuts.
Are you opposed to local government borrowing? And if so, how would you make up the money that would be gained by that?
Well, again, we've said that it needs to be spending reductions to bring it in line with the revenues that we have. Local government borrowing is borrowing. Local government borrowing is one of the worst kind of borrowing that you could do. It's a high interest rate, and it's kicking the can downhill and making the local governments have to deal with the problem that rightfully rests in Sacramento. So, no, I'm not in favor of that. I think that it creates a bigger problem 3 years from now, while you also affect public safety services at the local level.
And I would say that although not in favor of it, we're looking to local government to be partners in devising solutions which reduce commensurate costs if we're not going to borrow. We believe there are major reforms that essentially will reduce costs, which will come back to public safety, and potential actions which will facilitate realignment of responsibilities, which need to be a part of this overall conversation.
Do you think there's any realistic expectation that something will get done by June 15th?
Realistic? Well, obviously, Sam and I don't control when they decide to move. We can work as hard as we can to make sure that we get it done, but ultimately you're looking at two members of the minority party who don't control the agenda around here. We think that partnering with the governor and saying it needs to get done, working to make sure it gets done, is important work for us to do, but we don't control that.
Do you have a number as far as prison reform? Do you have a number you'd like to get down to, or that you think you could realistically get down to as far as the amount of money that should be spent per prisoner? I believe the number heard today was $49,000.
Yeah, out of that $49,000, $14,500 of that is for health care costs. Does the average individual out there in California, the average, even take a family, do they spend $14,500 a year on their health care? I don't think they do. But I can tell you this much, that that's where we need to be looking first before we're looking at early release that affects the safety of local communities. The numbers should be brought down, and we should be looking at making it more in line with, for example, why are we spending more money on prisoner health care than we do on Medi-Cal and Medi-Cal reimbursements? Why do we have Medi-Cal doctors receiving something that is far under market rates, and yet we have doctors in the prison healthcare system making $400,000 and $500,000 a year?
Majority leaders are saying that dismantling these programs, cuts aside, but also dismantling some of these service programs that are currently in existence, is a non-starter for them. What's your non-starter?
Taxes is a non-starter for me.
Well, and I would just say, under the Constitution, we can only spend as much money as we take in. So for the majority of the party to say these items are non-starters, they will need to find other commensurate offsetting cuts.
With that in mind, there is a rule of thumb in the corporate world to say that you can't cut your way to profitability. And so if that's the case, and granted governments aren't in the profit business, but they are trying to have a positive cash flow. If you can't cut your way out of it, and they're saying that revenue, you got to do it, what's your short-term revenue?
Well, you can't tax your way out of it either. Because understand that governments are not corporations. Corporations entice people to buy their product. Government goes out and collects the taxes or at the threat of putting somebody in jail. So the key is that we've got to put spending in line with revenues, period.
And I would say, although you can't cut your way to profitability, you can cut your way out of insolvency. And that is what the state of California is facing. We don't have the luxury of trying to determine how high our profits are going to be in that corporate metaphor. We're facing the potential of insolvency and a damaging to California's credit rating, which would be disastrous for years to come. So although I wish we were a place where we could talk about the highest, best use for each dollar, right now we're just trying to be sure that we keep the state's head above water. And if we don't make the right decisions in very short order, you'll be writing stories about California joining GM.
Well, do the governor's cuts that he's proposing go far enough for you?
I think probably in the aggregate they're getting very close to the number we would need. And as I said, the markets ultimately will vote with their feet. If we don't see sort of cuts and restructuring and reforms that we've been talking about, we won't be able to raise the money to avoid the cash crisis that should be upon us between July and September.
Last question.
Yeah, I think we're there. Go ahead.
Said that the proposal from the governor only gets 62% of the way to the problem through cuts, and that the rest of it is shifting of money.
There certainly are other things in the governor's proposal that are not spending reductions that we need to take a very close look at. The type of things that Kevin talked about, the revenue acceleration, we think are unwise. Local government borrowing is unwise. So, yeah, we're taking a close look at that through the open process of the Budget Conference Committee, and that's the way it should be.
Well, in that committee, you only have 2 members, and every year the Democrats vote out a budget, and then...
If you still have questions, they can take questions individually.
This will be the last one. The way you do that is you empower the conference committee so that when we get to those votes that are on a party line vote, that we stop, we have the discussions, and then we go back in and we make the vote based on what those discussions have yielded.